A slate sky pressed close to the deck. Waves knifed under gray light, each one a cold promise. On the bridge of a Type 7 U-boat, the skipper barked the single word that meant survival. Tauchen! Dive. Steel groaned as water rushed into ballast tanks and the boat slid beneath the skin of the ocean. Inside, men held their breath while the world above thudded with distant engines and the creak of compressing iron. High over the convoy lane, a Consolidated Liberator circled, its crew searching methodically for a periscope or a slick. When a brief radar return winked on the operator's screen, the pilot wheeled in and the order came down. Release. A small sealed cylinder slipped from the bomb bay and punched the water with a soft, neat plop. No explosion. No violent splash, only a whisper as the device sank away. Below, the U-boat's ears heard something unnatural, a faint, precise whine that moved with purpose. It did not tremble like a depth charge. It hunted, adjusting and steering, following the faintest pulse of propeller noise. Men in the dark fumbled controls, shut down motors, and tried to steal the ship as though holding one's breath could hide them. The sound drew nearer. Then a rupture. A column of air, a slick of oil, silence. The ocean had learned a new language. It had learned to listen. By 1942, the Atlantic had become a single, vast battlefield. There were no borders, only gray water and the slow, stubborn rhythm of merchant ships carrying Britain's survival west to east. Every convoy that left Halifax or New York meant coal for London's power plants, grain for its tables, and fuel for its bombers. And every mile of that ocean was hunted. Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-Boot-Waffe worked in packs. Guided by radio signals from occupied France, submarines fanned across shipping lanes, then converged like wolves when a contact was sighted. At night their torpedoes struck unseen. By dawn, the sea was a sheet of burning oil. The Allies struck back with depth-charge-equipped destroyers and new radar sets, but the ocean was too wide. Beyond Greenland lay the air gap, a 1,000-mile stretch no patrol aircraft could reach. There, U-boats surfaced freely, recharging batteries and stalking convoys in the mist. If spotted by a plane, they crash-dived, the one defense that always worked. Once under, they vanished into sound and darkness. By early 1943, the situation was desperate. Britain was losing ships faster than they could be built. The United States poured aircraft and destroyer escorts into the fight, yet still the submarines escaped. The pattern repeated endlessly: radar contact, attack, dive, silence. To break that silence, scientists were called in. The U.S. National Defense Research Committee posed a question few thought practical. Could a weapon hear? If a torpedo could follow the thrum of a propeller through water, it might kill a submarine even after it dove. In late 1942, Harvard's Underwater Sound Laboratory and Western Electric began secret experiments. Engineers tested hydrophones in cold Atlantic bays, studying how sound bent and scattered through salt water. They learned that every submarine produced a unique acoustic fingerprint, a low, steady pulse at 40 to 50 hertz. If a weapon could recognize that rhythm, it could steer itself. The prototype was small, 9 feet long, 19 inches wide, and weighed about 700 pounds. Its name was hidden behind bureaucracy: Mark 24 Mine. In truth, it was no mine at all, but the world's first airdropped acoustic homing torpedo. By early 1943, it was ready. The Allies would give it a friendlier nickname: FIDO. It would slip into the sea after a fleeing submarine and listen. The moment it found sound, it would follow. Soon, crash diving would no longer mean escape. FIDO's story was written not in shipyards, but in laboratories. In a small workshop at Harvard University's Underwater Sound Laboratory, scientists gathered around tanks of salt water, listening through hydrophones to the hum of model propellers. Every test began the same way. A technician dropped a miniature torpedo into the tank, and the room filled with static and low pulses from an oscilloscope. The engineers were learning to make machines hear. The project was classified under the National Defense Research Committee, NDRC. Coordinated by the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ordnance and supported by Bell Telephone Laboratories and Western Electric. In the middle of the Manhattan Project and radar research, this modest effort seemed minor, yet it would quietly change naval warfare forever. The principle was daringly simple. The torpedo would not rely on eyes, only on ears. When dropped from an aircraft, FIDO entered the ocean with its small propeller folded. After sinking to a programmed depth, it armed itself, extended its propeller, and began moving in slow spirals. Two hydrophones on either side of its nose listened for the distinctive rhythm of a submarine's propellers. A deep, regular thrum amid the ambient hiss of the sea. Its tiny onboard processor compared the volume between both hydrophones. If the sound was louder on the right, the torpedo turned right. If louder on the left, it turned left. It was a form of mechanical logic, the simplest version of what the world would one day call acoustic homing. The tests astonished even their creators. Off Narragansett Bay and Key West in late 1942, training submarines were ordered to dive and run silent. The prototype FIDO found them anyway. In one trial, it circled patiently for nearly 10 minutes before detecting a faint noise, then turned sharply and struck within 15 feet of the hull. The test commander wrote, "The target had no chance. The weapon does what it promises. It listens and it kills." Secrecy was absolute. To disguise its nature, the U.S. Navy issued the false designation Mark 24 Mine. Only a handful of officers knew the truth. The mine was no mine at all, but an airborne torpedo meant to chase submarines underwater. Crews who loaded them onto patrol aircraft were told little beyond weight, fuse timing, and drop altitude. Their orders were simple. If a U-boat crash-dived, drop 1. Then leave the area and report contact lost. In January 1943, FIDO entered limited production at Western Electric's manufacturing plants. Engineers built each weapon by hand, calibrating its hydrophones and magnetic compass to account for variations in saltwater density. Fewer than 1,000 were produced that first year, but each represented a revolution. The first operational units received them quietly. U.S. Navy patrol squadrons based in Iceland, Newfoundland, and the Azores. Their aircraft, consolidated B-24 Liberators and PBY Catalinas, had already begun using airborne radar to detect U-boats on the surface. Now they had a weapon that could strike after the enemy vanished beneath the waves. In April 1943, FIDO was tested in combat. A U.S. Navy Liberator spotted a surfaced submarine west of the Bay of Biscay. The German vessel dived immediately. The pilot released a single mine into the water and turned away. Minutes later, the radar operator reported a sudden spreading oil slick. No explosion had been seen, but the submarine did not reappear. It was the first confirmed FIDO kill. More followed. In May alone, 3 U-boats vanished under nearly identical circumstances. There were no survivors, no distress signals, only patches of fuel and debris. German intelligence officers were baffled. They suspected new types of depth charge or improved sonar. The idea that a torpedo could home on them seemed impossible. By the summer of 1943, FIDO was deployed across both the Atlantic and Mediterranean theaters. The U.S. Navy, Royal Air Force Coastal Command, and Royal Canadian Air Force used it interchangeably. Its effectiveness soon matched, and in some areas surpassed, the performance of escort destroyers. The results were devastating. Out of approximately 200 FIDOs dropped in combat, more than 30 confirmed kills were recorded, with dozens more probables. Considering each U-boat carried 50 men, the human cost was immense, but the strategic effect was even greater. Crash diving, once a guaranteed escape, was no longer safe. The U-boat crews had always trusted the ocean's darkness. Now, that darkness listened back. Admiral Donitz's command staff in Lorient began receiving cryptic reports from surviving submarines. Torpedo follows. No evasion possible. Some captains claimed to have shut off engines and escaped by luck. Most never returned at all. By autumn 1943, Allied pilots were calling FIDO the faithful dog. When released, it always found its mark. Every battle has a sound. For the men of the U-boats, it was the heartbeat of diesel engines and the rhythmic hiss of compressed air. That sound meant life, the steady pulse of a machine that kept them moving through the black Atlantic. When aircraft were sighted, everything changed. "Alarm! Dive!" The order echoed down the length of the hull. Men vaulted over pipes, sealing hatches, spinning wheels, diving toward their posts. The crash dive was a practiced ritual. 45 men vanishing beneath the surface in under 30 seconds. Depth gauges spun downward. Lights dimmed to red. The sea pressed harder and harder on steel. Before FIDO, that maneuver almost always worked. Bombs and depth charges exploded above, but they were blind, timed guesses. After a few terrifying minutes of concussion and noise, silence returned, and the captain could rise again to periscope depth. The ocean was their shield. But in 1943, that silence began to lie. Below the surface, crews started hearing a new sound, faint, metallic, and purposeful. It didn't come in a pattern like a propeller or detonation. It moved, it searched. The first time it happened, some men thought it was an engine fault, a bearing grinding loose. Then the noise grew louder, steady as breath. The torpedo room trembled. The sonar operator listened, pale and motionless, his headset full of a rising whine. There was no time to evade. The sound closed in like a predator. When FIDO struck, it was rarely the catastrophic explosion of Hollywood myth. More often, it was a deep, single crack, the kind that meant the hull had fractured. Seawater rushed in through seams. Lights failed. The submarine shuddered once, twice, and began to fall. In the dark, men shouted prayers that no one heard. For Allied air crews, those same moments unfolded differently. Inside a B-24 Liberator, or PBY Catalina, the crew worked by procedure. Radar operator calls contact. Pilot aligns. The weapons officer flips a guarded switch. The torpedo release light turns green. One short call. Mine away. Then the aircraft climbs, engines droning, circling the spot. They see nothing at first, only an empty patch of sea. Minutes pass. Then a slick of oil begins to spread. Sometimes a wooden crate or a life vest surfaces, but rarely a man. The crew notes the time, the coordinates, and turns for home. There was no joy in it. Pilots later described FIDO strikes as victories they could neither see nor feel. "We didn't see them die," one recalled, "but we knew they were gone. It was just a black mark on the map and silence on the radio." The strange symmetry of the weapon defined that phase of the war. Two groups of men, neither seeing the other, both trapped by sound. For the Germans, the ocean had always been both enemy and ally, cruel yet protective. Now it betrayed them. Crash diving no longer promised safety. It meant surrendering to the very medium that carried the weapon to them. The psychological toll was immense. U-boat commanders grew hesitant to attack convoys at all. Reports to Donitz's headquarters began to read like confessions. Depth charges ineffective, but new underwater weapon follows. Noise increases until impact. Impossible to evade. Some crews tried desperate tricks, cutting engines to go silent, ejecting oil and debris to fake destruction, or turning stern first to confuse the weapon's sensors. Nothing consistently worked. The torpedo's hearing was patient. It waited for any hint of movement. In Allied mess halls, the mood was different, but not entirely triumphant. Airmen spoke quietly about the new dog they carried. They knew it ended fights quickly, but it also erased the thrill of pursuit. The sea battles that had once been duels of endurance were now one-sided executions delivered by machines. The moral question surfaced only later, when the war was won and the reports were declassified. Did FIDO give submariners a fair chance to survive? Or had technology crossed into something colder, a kind of automated killing that removed all human contact? At the time, no one asked. Convoys had to reach Britain. Ships had to live. And somewhere between necessity and mercy, the ocean itself became the judge. FIDO's genius lay in its simplicity and its restraint. It was not a fast torpedo, nor a powerful one. It moved slowly, almost gently, through the deep. 12 knots, a careful spiral, the patient curiosity of a machine built to hear. It carried only a 92-pound Torpex warhead, small by naval standards. But power was never its purpose. Precision was. Its acoustic system, a pair of hydrophones on its nose, could sense a target hundreds of yards away. Engineers had tuned them to the low-frequency hum of a U-boat's twin propellers. Above all, they designed it for subtlety. It would not detonate on mere proximity. It would wait until it heard certainty. Inside its cylindrical body, the guidance unit compared the sound strength between the two sensors. If the signal in the left ear was stronger, it corrected left. If louder in the right, it turned right. Slowly, patiently, it narrowed the difference until the sound merged into one, the moment of perfect alignment. Then it lunged. In those seconds, everything that had defined submarine warfare changed. For 30 years, from the North Sea to the Atlantic, submarines had relied on silence and invisibility. FIDO erased both. It made sound, once their heartbeat, into a death sentence. The weapon's design also reflected its creator's restraint. Its small charge was meant to cripple, not annihilate, so that survivors could be captured and interrogated. The goal was deterrence, not extermination. But in the crushing depths of the Atlantic, theory rarely survived contact with pressure. Most hits were fatal. When fragments of a recovered FIDO were first examined by German engineers in 1944, disbelief turned to alarm. The hydrophones and small control gyros were clearly designed for acoustic tracking, something German research had explored but never achieved in such compact form. Admiral Dönitz's staff immediately classified all reports mentioning listening mines. Orders went out. Submarines were to reduce speed to under 4 knots after diving, and to cut engines completely when under air attack. But the countermeasures came too late. The weapon's logic required only the faintest hum to begin pursuit. Even the creak of a hull or the gurgle of water from ballast vents could trigger its sensors. Some commanders tried releasing decoys, small canisters that emitted bubbles and noise, but few carried enough to make a difference. The Atlantic itself, dense and echoing, betrayed them. FIDO's slow, deliberate movement made it almost impossible to evade. Standard submarine evasive maneuvers, hard turns, depth changes, noise bursts, only confused the crew, not the weapon. In its quiet spiral, it kept listening, adjusting, correcting, until the sound of a submarine was centered once again. The moral questions that followed were complex. Some Allied officers celebrated the invention as pure science applied to survival. Others felt uneasy. One British Coastal Command report, declassified decades later, noted, "There is little in war so detached as the use of acoustic weapons. The enemy dies unseen, unheard, and unknown. One cannot quite call it combat." FIDO's designers, many of them civilian scientists, expressed mixed feelings after the war. At Harvard's Underwater Sound Laboratory, one physicist admitted, "We built something marvelous and terrible, a weapon that kills by listening. I sometimes wonder if we taught the ocean cruelty." Yet, for the men fighting the Atlantic War, there was no philosophical distance. Merchant ships were burning every night, sailors freezing in lifeboats, and convoys vanishing in mid-ocean. FIDO was not revenge. It was equilibrium restored. The weapon's impact rippled far beyond tactics. It heralded a new era, the union of detection and destruction. Until then, radar found targets and weapons destroyed them. Separate steps, separate systems. FIDO fused those functions. It was a sensor, processor, and killer in one body, the ancestor of every guided missile and smart torpedo that would follow. Even the language of warfare began to change. Pilots spoke not of seeing but of acquiring, locking, homing. The age of guided intelligence had begun. The Germans recognized the shift, too. Post-war interrogations revealed that Dönitz privately called the weapon the Hunter of the Deep. He admitted that, after its arrival, his crew's morale collapsed faster than their numbers. "Our men no longer trusted the water," he said. They feared the silence. And silence was all the Atlantic had left. FIDO did not end the U-boat war alone, but it marked the moment when technology overtook courage, when the physics of sound replaced the gamble of chance. It was, in many ways, the first whisper of the modern battlefield, one where machines would listen, think, and kill without needing to see. The Atlantic, once ruled by invisible predators, now had a new master, one that hunted by echo. Bay of Biscay, May 1943. The spring sea rolled under a pale sky. Somewhere north of Spain, a convoy's protective screen of patrol aircraft spread out in a long arc, engines humming low. To the German submariners of U-456, it was another day in a war they believed they understood. They had survived depth charges, radar, and relentless destroyers. When aircraft appeared, they dove, trusting the ocean to hide them. That afternoon, a Sunderland flying boat of the RAF's Coastal Command caught sight of the periscope wake. Its crew reacted instantly. The pilot dove to attack. The U-boat slipped beneath the surface. On the aircraft's intercom, the weapons officer called out the new command: "Release 1 mine." The weapon fell cleanly through the air, struck the sea, and vanished. No explosion, no plume of spray, just a widening ring of ripples. The British crew circled once, expecting nothing. Then, after nearly 2 minutes, the water erupted. A column of air and oil burst to the surface. A single cork hatch floated up, spinning gently. The Sunderland crew recorded coordinates, radioed "contact destroyed," and turned for home. They never knew that U-456's captain had ordered engines stopped, believing the aircraft had gone. In the silence, his sonar operator reported a new sound, faint and regular, as if the sea itself were ticking. Seconds later, the stern broke apart. That was FIDO's first verified kill. Within weeks, similar stories spread across the Atlantic. Off Newfoundland, a U.S. Navy Liberator of Squadron VP-84 spotted a diving submarine at dusk. The radar operator tracked the fading contact. The pilot released a single torpedo. 4 minutes later, the sea boiled with fuel and debris. No survivors. Between May and August 1943, the Allies recorded more than a dozen such kills. The pattern was identical each time: aircraft sighting, crash dive, silence, oil slick. To the Germans, it seemed like witchcraft. Admiral Donitz's situation reports began listing unknown underwater weapon as a cause of loss. The timing was catastrophic for the Kriegsmarine. May 1943 was already Black May, the month the U-boat arm suffered its heaviest losses of the entire war. Allied radar, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, and ultra-intelligence had turned the Atlantic from hunting ground to trap. Now came a weapon that made the very act of diving, the submariner's last defense, a potential death sentence. Everywhere the U-boats went, the sea betrayed them. In the Bay of Biscay, aircraft from Coastal Command's No. 19 and 120 squadrons patrolled the routes between French bases and the open ocean. With radar and FIDO, they no longer feared cloud cover or darkness. When radar picked up a surface echo, they attacked immediately. If the submarine slipped under, the pilot simply dropped a torpedo and climbed away. Minutes later, the result was usually the same: bubbles, oil, and nothing more. The Germans tried to adapt. They reinforced periscopes, improved crash dive times, and experimented with coating hulls in rubber to dampen sound. But these were gestures, not solutions. FIDO did not need loud targets. It only needed persistence. The psychological impact was devastating. For the first time, U-boat crews began reporting fear of the ocean itself. "The sea has turned against us," one radio man wrote in his log. "It whispers our death." The weapon's quiet efficiency changed Allied tactics as well. Instead of full attack runs with depth charges, aircraft began striking alone, conserving ammunition and avoiding risk. Each encounter became a surgical hunt. By late summer, U-boat bases at Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire were receiving fewer and fewer transmissions from boats at sea. Of those that returned, many were badly damaged. Crews reported broken propeller shafts, flooded compartments, and half their men deaf from concussions. Most spoke of a new horror, a sound that followed them underwater. It wasn't just the numbers that broke the U-boat arm, it was faith. For years, they had believed in the infallibility of the crash dive, the sanctity of the deep. When that belief died, the war beneath the waves was already lost. Allied analysts understood what was happening. Reports circulated within the Royal Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division. The enemy now faces a psychological as well as material defeat. Crash diving no longer ensures escape. They cannot trust their element. The Atlantic, once the hunter's sea, was becoming the graveyard of its hunters. And as 1943 turned to 1944, the weapon would reach its full maturity, used by entire patrol squadrons, striking not in isolation but as part of a seamless network of radar, radio, and acoustic death. The ocean had become a sensor. North Atlantic, autumn 1943. The U-boat war was collapsing. The hunters had become the hunted, and the sea itself no longer provided cover. Every dive was a risk, every escape route a calculation of how long silence could save them. From Iceland to the Bay of Biscay, the Allied patrols now flew in layers, radar-equipped liberators above, Sunderlands and Catalinas sweeping low, and, when needed, destroyers waiting below to finish what the aircraft began. In this new hierarchy, FIDO was the executioner. One of the most chilling demonstrations came on October 10, 1943, when U-960 commanded by Oberleutnant Eckhard Wolff, was intercepted off the northwest coast of Spain. She was returning damaged from an aborted attack on a convoy. A British Liberator of 86 Squadron, guided by radar, caught her on the surface. Wolff ordered the crash dive. The aircraft dropped 2 torpedoes, both acoustic. Below, the crew of U-960 heard the unfamiliar noise almost immediately, a steady hum circling them in the dark. They cut power, drifted, then tried to rise to periscope depth. The sound vanished for a moment. Relief. Then, suddenly it returned, louder, closer. Seconds later, the hull shook violently. Lights failed. The boat began taking water fast. Wolff had no choice. He surfaced, beached his submarine on the Spanish coast, and ordered the crew ashore. Of 50 men, 37 survived. One of the rare cases where FIDO's purpose, to cripple rather than obliterate, had worked exactly as designed. Elsewhere, mercy was rare. 640 was lost under almost identical circumstances in the same month. Aircraft from the U.S. Navy's VP-84 squadron caught her north of the Azores. After diving, she was never seen again. The same fate befell U-231 and U-456 earlier that summer. In each case, the signature pattern appeared. Radar sighting, crash dive, no explosion, no survivors, and hours later an oil slick marking the grave. As the weapon proliferated, so did its legend. Allied airmen began calling it the faithful dog, because it always found its target. German crews adopted darker nicknames: Der Seehund, the Sea Hound, and Der Tod, Der hört, the death that listens. By 1944, FIDO was standard armament on nearly every long-range patrol aircraft in the Atlantic. Production ramped up to over 4,000 units, and operational use expanded from the North Atlantic into the Mediterranean, the Bay of Biscay, and eventually the Norwegian Sea. Each success fed into a larger strategy. With radar and ultra-intelligence pinpointing U-boat positions, the Allies created coordinated air-sea traps. When submarines surfaced to recharge batteries, radar-equipped liberators descended on them. If the U-boat dove, a single FIDO followed it down. The result was nearly absolute dominance, a level of precision warfare unthinkable only a year earlier. The Germans tried to counter the invisible threat. Naval engineers developed Pillenwerfer, pill throwers, canisters that released loud bubbles and mechanical clatter meant to mimic propeller sounds. But they were heavy, few in number, and often fooled no one. The torpedo's hydrophones could distinguish genuine machinery from decoy noise. Commanders were instructed to dive deeper, turn stern first toward the weapon, and run at low speed to minimize acoustic signature. These tactics occasionally saved a crew, but at the cost of control, running blind and nearly motionless in darkness, praying the sound would fade. Many never knew whether it did. By the time the Normandy invasion began in June 1944, Dönitz's once proud submarine fleet was a shadow of its former self. Over two-thirds of his operational U-boats were lost that year alone. The survivors stayed close to coastal waters, their patrols shorter, their confidence gone. The Allies had done more than kill submarines. They had broken an idea. The myth of the untouchable deep had died. Still, the technology continued to evolve. Engineers refined FIDO into improved variants, the Mark 27 and Mark 28, capable of higher speeds and more selective targeting. American scientists even began adapting the concept for anti-surface use, testing homing torpedoes against ships. But none carried the shock of that first version. FIDO had already changed the ocean. Late in 1944, the weapon scored one of its last major kills, U-864, a long-range transport carrying cargo for Japan. Detected by radar, it dived and was struck by a single acoustic torpedo. The entire crew of 73 perished. By early 1945, German submarine operations had effectively ceased. The Kriegsmarine still launched boats, but most never returned. The Atlantic had become a graveyard of steel, and when the war finally ended, Allied secrecy about the weapon remained ironclad. Combat reports described FIDO only as special mine. Airmen were warned never to discuss its existence. It would remain classified until 1946, long after the last U-boat had surrendered. In total, about 204 FIDOs were launched in combat. Of those, roughly 1 in 4 resulted in a confirmed kill, an extraordinary rate in submarine warfare. More importantly, the weapon changed behavior. Submarines spent less time attacking and more time hiding. In Dönitz's post-war analysis, he admitted, "It was not the number of torpedoes that defeated us, but the knowledge that the ocean could now hear." In that knowledge, the Atlantic War ended, not with a final battle, but with the quiet certainty that the deep was no longer safe. When the last U-boat surrendered in May 1945, the Atlantic was still littered with the wrecks of its predecessors, twisted steel tombs resting in silence. Yet few understood at the time what had truly ended the submarine war. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who briefly succeeded Hitler as Germany's final leader, would later admit that by 1944 the ocean itself had turned hostile. "We no longer controlled the depths," he wrote. The enemy had learned to hear. The FIDO acoustic torpedo had not destroyed hundreds of submarines by itself, but it had done something more decisive. It had removed the U-boat's last psychological refuge. For 2 years, crash diving had been an iron law of survival. Now it was a gamble with death. Allied records compiled after the war told the story in numbers. 204 FIDO torpedoes dropped in combat. 37 confirmed kills. Roughly 50 additional probable kills or crippling hits. That might seem modest, but when measured against the small number deployed, and the vast size of the Atlantic, it represented a breakthrough. Each loss spread fear among hundreds of U-boat crews who never saw the weapon but heard its legend. The cumulative effect was strategic paralysis. By mid-1944, U-boat commanders spent up to 90% of their patrols submerged, traveling at minimal speed to avoid detection. That meant less time attacking convoys and more time drifting helplessly, consuming battery power. The once aggressive wolf packs had become isolated, cautious, and defensive. The hunter instinct that had defined them since 1939 was gone. The Allies, meanwhile, learned to integrate FIDO into a larger machine of surveillance and strike. Radar-equipped aircraft patrolled day and night. Escort carriers extended their range into the mid-Atlantic. Sonar buoys tracked submarine movements. And the FIDO torpedo completed the chain, the final link between detection and destruction. In official communiques, however, the weapon's name never appeared. Secrecy was total. Combat logs listed each deployment as Mark 24 mine. Pilots were told to drop one only after a submarine had dived, never at a surface target, to conceal its acoustic nature. If a pilot was captured even under interrogation, the cover story would hold. The deception succeeded so completely that, when the war ended, many Allied airmen who had used FIDO still believed they had been dropping a new type of depth charge. Only a handful of ordnance officers and scientists knew the truth. The weapon's development remained classified until 1946, when the first technical papers were quietly released to selected naval research departments. Its secrecy had been vital. If the Germans had learned earlier how the torpedo worked, they might have built countermeasures, noisemakers, decoy emitters, or protective screens. In the end, they barely understood it even after defeat. A single recovered FIDO casing, washed ashore in France in 1944, led to brief panic among German engineers. They called it Jarret 24, believing it to be some kind of self-guided sea mine. The real principles behind it remained beyond their wartime research capabilities. When the Allies analyzed post-war reports, the results were clear. FIDO had not merely improved kill rates, it had reshaped behavior. The mere rumor of its existence made U-boat captains alter tactics, slowing operations across the Atlantic. It was a psychological warfare delivered by physics. But the weapon also marked something new in human conflict, a shift toward impersonal precision. In earlier years, war at sea had meant battles of endurance, destroyers chasing sonar echoes, submarines stalking convoys through fog. FIDO replaced those hours of tension with a few quiet minutes of certainty. Once dropped, there was nothing left to do but listen. Some Allied commanders found that unsettling. Admiral Sir Max Horton, head of Western Approaches Command, reportedly said after the war, "We won the Atlantic not with heroics, but with circuits." It was both a victory and a warning. The success of FIDO did not go unnoticed in Washington or London. Within months, new acoustic and magnetic torpedo projects were underway. The logic of guided warfare, of weapons that could think in simple ways, had proven itself. As for the men who created it, their names rarely appeared in medals lists. Most returned to academia, continuing research in sonar and underwater acoustics. When asked later about the project, one scientist remarked quietly, "We made something that listened better than men ever could." For the thousands of sailors who vanished beneath the Atlantic, the ocean itself became their monument, vast, cold, and now forever haunted by the sound of a torpedo that they learned to hear. When peace returned to the Atlantic, the secret that had ended its longest battle remained buried in classified files and the cold water itself. The Allies called it the Mark 24 mine in every report. To the public, it never existed. But within military research circles, it became a blueprint. The first proof that guidance, not power, would define the next generation of weapons. In the years immediately after 1945, the scientists who had built FIDO returned to universities and naval laboratories. They carried with them the lessons of sound, how water bends it, how metal shapes it, and how machinery can recognize it. Their work quietly seeded the next wave of acoustic and electronic warfare. At the newly formed Office of Naval Research, experiments began on more advanced homing torpedoes, the Mark 27 Cutie and later the Mark 43, direct descendants of FIDO's small, listening brain. These post-war models could discriminate between targets, follow faster submarines, and even switch to magnetic or thermal tracking when sound vanished. By the early 1950s, the Cutie and its successors were standard weapons aboard U.S. submarines and destroyers. The Soviet Union, studying captured German research, pursued its own path. But even their most advanced post-war designs lagged behind the acoustic sophistication of FIDO's lineage. For the next 2 decades, the seas would be patrolled by torpedoes that no longer needed human aim, machines that hunted by algorithm. The Cold War gave those ideas new urgency. The Atlantic and Pacific became chessboards again, But now the players were superpowers armed with nuclear submarines. Detection meant survival. The hydrophones first used in FIDO's nose evolved into vast networks, underwater arrays stretching across the oceans, capable of hearing a propeller thousands of miles away. Those lines of listening stations, the U.S. Navy's SOSUS network, were, in essence, FIDO's ghost spread across the globe. Each cable, each sensor, was a descendant of the torpedo that had first listened for its prey in 1943. The moral and philosophical implications also deepened. FIDO had been the first true smart weapon, a machine that used feedback from its environment to make decisions. Its descendants would carry that logic into missiles, drones, and digital warfare. The modern concept of fire and forget, a weapon that completes the kill on its own, began in that quiet Atlantic experiment. Yet, for those who had served during the Battle of the Atlantic, the memory of what it replaced remained personal. Submarine crews of the post-war German Navy studied Allied debriefs and spoke of FIDO with a kind of grim respect. One officer, reading the British records in 1952, simply wrote, "It was not a weapon against men, but against the idea of hiding. In that sense, FIDO symbolized the end of an era, the death of invisibility as a defense." Naval doctrine changed accordingly. Anti-submarine warfare, ASW, evolved from pursuit to prediction. No longer did ships chase echoes for hours. Instead, networks of sensors, aircraft, and computers mapped probabilities, identifying where an enemy would be rather than where he was. The war at sea became mathematical, a contest of signal and silence. Technologically, FIDO's DNA persisted in unexpected places. The hydrophone technology used to detect propeller noise led directly to early underwater microphones for oceanographic research. The algorithms developed to compare sound strength became part of the foundation for digital signal processing, the same principle behind sonar, radar, and even early speech recognition. In that sense, FIDO didn't just end one war, it began a new field of science. By the 1960s, as submarines went nuclear and capable of remaining submerged for months, the lessons of 1943 were rediscovered. Designers of the U.S. Navy's Mark 46 and Mark 48 torpedoes, weapons that could travel at 50 knots and think through complex pursuit patterns, often cited the Mark 24 as their ancestor. One engineer at Gould Ocean Systems later remarked, "We've just spent decades teaching FIDO to run faster." When the weapon was finally declassified, museums displayed its restored shape, small, black, almost unremarkable. Visitors walked past it, rarely realizing that it had changed the ocean's nature forever. For those who understood, its legacy was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. The idea that technology could render courage irrelevant, that a weapon could strip war of human struggle, was a truth the world would confront again in missiles, satellites, and autonomous drones. The ocean had been the first to whisper that truth back in 1943. It whispered through sound waves, through patience, through a torpedo that listened, and from that whisper grew the entire vocabulary of modern warfare: precision, guidance, and the quiet certainty of machines that hunt without sight. The Battle of the Atlantic began as a test of courage and endurance. It ended as a test of understanding. In 1940, men hunted each other across the open sea by instinct and skill, eyes straining for silhouettes, ears pressed to hydrophones, hearts timed to the rhythm of depth charges. By 1945, the sea itself had become the weapon. Machines could now sense, think, and strike faster than any human could react. The ocean had learned to listen, and that changed everything. FIDO was small, almost delicate by the standards of war, yet it marked a threshold. It was the moment when sound ceased to be a warning and became a trigger, when survival depended less on bravery than on silence. Its whine in the dark was the voice of a new age, impersonal, precise, inevitable. For the German submariners, the Atlantic had once been a vast refuge. When FIDO arrived, that refuge turned into a mirror, reflecting their own noise back at them. For the Allied airmen, the torpedo was both savior and burden, a weapon that killed unseen, leaving only oil and foam to prove it had worked. No cheers, no triumph, just another empty sea. And yet, in that cold precision lay the future. The same principles that guided FIDO now guide satellites, missiles, drones. Instruments that listen, calculate, and act without hesitation. The lineage of the weapon lives on not in the museums that display its shell, but in every system that hunts by signal instead of sight. The men who built it never meant to change the nature of war. They only wanted to save convoys, to make the ocean safe again. But the price of that safety was a kind of silence. The silence that follows when machines learn to do what men once feared to imagine. In the deep Atlantic, where steel lies rusting on the seabed, that silence remains. It is the sound of an ocean that remembers the moment humanity taught it to hear.